Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. Do you ever buy something when it's on sale and then you don't know what you're going to do with it? I got a bunch of fat quarters for about 50 cents each a long time ago on a big sale. They've been in my stash for quite a while and they take up a lot of room and they bug me, so I finally pulled them all out and decided I was going to use them. The first thing I decided to do was go ahead and press these nice and flat. Now, I saw a new HST technique that I had never heard of before, where you make 32 HSTs. So I made squares as big as I could with these fat quarters. My squares turned out to be 17 inches by 17 inches, and I gave the cutoff on the side a nice straight edge for later. So to start with, I'm taking two of my squared up fat quarters, 17-inch squares. I'm going to place those right sides together. Next, I'm going to be drawing some lines across the wrong side of my green fabric. So first I'm drawing one diagonal line from corner to corner. Next, I'm drawing another diagonal line the opposite direction from corner to corner. Next, I'm drawing a vertical line through the middle of this fat quarter square. I'm lining it up on the point where those two diagonal lines meet and using the edges of the fabric to line up with my horizontal lines on my ruler. Then I drew a horizontal line through the middle of my fat quarter square. And last, I drew a square on point around the outside. So I'm basically dividing this in my mind into 4 quadrants, and I'm drawing a diagonal line across that makes a square that's on point around this 17-inch square. So each of these 4 quadrants will now have an X. I'm going to be stitching on both sides of all the diagonal lines. I'm making myself little marks on my straight horizontal and vertical lines to remind me that I am not stitching those. Those are cut lines. I have seen this method where people use 2 different pens, maybe a red for the diagonal sew lines and then maybe a blue for the horizontal and vertical no sew lines. Those will just be cut lines later. Now 17 inches is a pretty big square, so I did use some pins to hold this all in place before I took it to the sewing machine. I pinned on both sides of the diagonal lines, giving myself enough space to stitch. I pinned directly across the horizontal and vertical lines, so I would remember not to stitch around those lines. Now here is a look at this square, these 2 squares, right sides together, and you can see I've stitched down both sides of all of the diagonal lines going both directions. I have not stitched the vertical and the horizontal line at all. Now it's time to cut this apart. I'm going to cut on the main horizontal and vertical line first. Then I'm going to cut the quadrants into horizontal and vertical lines. Then I'm going to cut on all of those diagonal sew lines that I made. So I really didn't have any idea before I started what size of half square triangle I was going to end up with. I think if you sewed your seams perfectly, you'd probably end up with about 4 inches. But I trimmed all my half square triangles from this process to 3 3/4. I lined up the diagonal line on my ruler with the seam line. Then I made sure the fabric overlapped the left and bottom 3 3/4 marks. Then I trimmed the right-hand side and the top side. Then I flipped the unit around the opposite way, lined it up again, and trimmed the other two sides. Well, that was interesting, and I'm definitely going to use that 32 HST method again sometime. But I also wanted to mix this up a little bit, so I decided to use the Easy 8 method for some of these 17-inch squares. Very similar, we're going to draw a diagonal line going one way and a diagonal line going the other way. I'm drawing the vertical and the horizontal cut lines. The lines are halfway across the 17 inches. And this is going to make 8 half square triangles. First, I'm going to stitch on both sides of the diagonal lines. Here's how that looks after stitching. The first line I'm going to cut is my vertical line. Then I'm going to cut that horizontal line. Then I'll also cut directly on the diagonal lines that I drew. I pressed the half square triangles open. For these 17-inch squares, it looks like my half square triangles can be trimmed to 8 inches. On this particular half square triangle, my left and my bottom sides lined up exactly on the 8-inch line, so all I had to trim on the other side was that dog ear. I decided to make mostly the larger half square triangles, but I did pick 2 more fabrics to make the 32 half square triangles smaller size, just to mix this up a little bit. When I'm working with really large pieces like this, I don't like to chain piece. So you'll see I'm stitching both sides of the diagonal line on one set at a time. With all the stitching completed, I went ahead and did all my cuts, and you'll notice I do cut that vertical and horizontal line first. That way, if things get messed up, I still have my stitched lines to guide me. Here's the unit where I used the 32 HST method, and you can see I separated each quadrant and then did my horizontal and vertical cuts, then my diagonal cuts. From each fat quarter, I had about 2 to 4 inches left over, and I sewed these strips all together, one after another, chain piecing, until I had one long strip. Once that was all stitched together, it was time to press everything. And this is the most tedious part in my way of thinking. I don't really like to press, but I did get all the large, the small HSTs pressed. I got that strip of the cast-offs pressed nice and flat. I trimmed off the sides of that strip set, and then I started trimming my half square triangles. I cut my strip set into 3-inch width. With everything ready to go, ready to stitch together, I knew I was just going to be making rows. So I was going to try and make one row out of these small HSTs and maybe another row out of the green and purple small HSTs. Then I would take each color of the large HSTs and make a row with separate colors. I thought about having the HSTs all going one direction or maybe doing chevrons, and then I decided, you know what, I'm just going to make this happen randomly. I'm going to chain piece everything, and I'm not going to worry about matching things up. I joined my 3-inch strip units together to make one long 3-inch strip. I chain pieced all my large half square triangles together as well, making rows of each color. Well, I did have to lay everything out on the floor to take a look. I wasn't sure if I was going to have enough length on various rows to make a quilt top. But here is the layout I came up with. I had enough of the 3-inch strips to make 3 rows, and I had those 2 small half square triangle units that made 2 complete rows as well. Next, I just picked up 2 rows at a time and stitched them together. Once all the rows were joined into pairs, I started putting 2 pairs together to complete this quilt top. Since the strip rows and the tiny half square triangle rows are dividing those big HST rows, there is no matching for this quilt top. I wanted to make this quilt top just a little bit bigger, so I did look in my stash for some fabric that would complement these bright colors, and here is the aqua that I came up with. So I cut some strips from this and made myself a border. I cut 4-inch strips to make my border, and then with the little bit that I had left, I cut 2.5-inch strips to add to my stash. I joined all the strips. Then I pressed those seams flat. Then I went around the quilt side by side, adding a border. Once I was all the way around the quilt, all I had to do was square up each corner. I was really surprised at how much I love this quilt. I was just kind of throwing together some fat corners that I didn't like, didn't want to use, and then I came out with this lovely bright quilt top. I just love it. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to subscribe to my channel. Click that little bell icon if you want to get notifications when I post new videos. And I truly thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it, and I hope to see you back again real soon.